We're going to start here pretty soon. We have, so I opened it up this time for both in person and live, and we have about an equal number of people live joining in here, which is exciting, and I'm glad that they're going to be able to do this. But I just love seeing all of your faces. I mean, woohoo! A little bit about home. In case you're not familiar, we're education and advocacy regarding housing in Ventura County and the full spectrum of housing, from support housing, temporary, transitional housing, affordable, missing middle, senior, you know, with certain specific populations. We need it all in here, and even building. Research has showed that even building even the upper scale, or reselling the upper scale, people move up, you know, from a smaller house to here, from an apartment, and it frees up apartment so that the person in an affordable housing can be in the apartment, which frees up that, oh my gosh, very precious spot of affordable housing, which we have 5-6 year waiting lists for. So it's all important, and we're always trying to push, you know, to work smarter and to work together and cooperate for that. I really love seeing all of you because this is all about partnership and cooperation. And, you know, if we each do what we do the best and work together, then we get everything done. We do great things. We have a housing. We should have one more of these August, September. And then we have our big housing conference in October. So if you don't know about our housing conference, let me know. I will send out information about that too. It's going to be in Oxnard Performing Arts Center on the 13th, kind of an 8 a.m. to about a 1:30. So about 200 plus people. So it's a nice good conference to network with too. But I'm so happy today to have Thomas Dougherty. He published an article on Godshuizen. Back kind of at the beginning of COVID, I saw it. I saw it through Strong Towns. If you're not familiar with Strong Towns, awesome. Get on their little email list and you'll get to read their articles and stuff. And it really struck me as really important. I'd been struggling with my own mother in her aging process. Not only with just dementia, but then as Alzheimer's just creeping in and her mobility issues. And that whole decision between keeping her in her single family house, which is what she wanted to be, and providing her with the support and the care that she actually needed and sometimes not recognize that she needed. And, you know, we had the family, we had the financial resources, but not everybody does. And there needs to be something between that single family house and the institutional kind of more setting. And so when I read Thomas's article, it was just fabulous, and it just really spoke home to me. And gosh, we need this in Ventura County. So that's where this is. He's going to do his little presentation. He's probably really a lot more able to tell about his background. So Thomas, please say a little bit about your background too in this presentation. And he's in Pennsylvania, which is why he's not here live, but so glad we could get him. And then following Thomas's presentation, we'll have a little bit of Q&A. If you have a question, live people, you can just come up to the seat here and talk, and he'll be able to see you and everything. People that are doing this virtually, just type in your questions into the Q&A, and then I'll read them out loud, and then he can answer for everybody. And then following that, we have people from Ventura County area Area Agency on Aging. Did I say that right? Ari's here live, and we have Sonia that's going to be virtually presenting. Just making sure. Okay. And so then they're going to talk about how we bring all of Thomas's wonderful ideas back to Ventura County and what our needs are in the county here. Okay. So, Thomas and Miguel, can you do your magic here?
Thank you, Karen.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Karen, if you can just mute your mic.
Yeah. I'm going to mute myself though here.
Are we good?
Sorry. Yes,
Great.
we're good.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm pleased to be with you virtually. As Karen noted, I live and work as an architect in Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is just outside Philadelphia. I want to thank Karen again for asking me to speak today and reiterate. I had written an article about the Godshouses of Bruges maybe about a year ago, and Karen reached out to me to talk about that, talk about Ventura, the needs there. And it is a little odd, that my background, I'm an architect, so what brought me to studying these places which were designed for elderly. So I just want to give you a brief introduction, I guess, to how I got from, architecture, to here. So I grew up on a small farm, actually, along the Ohio River near Pittsburgh. So I didn't grow up in suburbia, and I also didn't grow up in an urban setting. So I was kind of standing back, like seeing both growing up. I had friends in both. And as an undergraduate, I remember I spent a semester in Austria, and it was a monastery from the 12th century. It was really my first experience, both in the monastery and then, all the cities and towns of Austria and Germany and Italy, experiencing places, traditional urban settings, and the kind of life that it made possible. The piazzas, the kind of people that use the piazzas. What is the encounter with somebody in a public space like that? And so when I got back from Austria, I was committed to pursuing this, and my background as a farmer was basically, among other things, lots of building barns and stuff. So I had a background in construction. And when I got back to the United States, I started timber framing, which is large beam, mortise and tenon, traditional construction. And I traveled with the Timber Framers Guild in America for a couple years, and then settled down at a shop in Philadelphia. And I found myself, it was a great shop, and I really appreciated the work there, but I was building, multi-million-dollar pool houses or second homes or third homes for wealthy people, and the buildings were not contributing to the civic realm. So what had attracted me to this durable, beautiful construction, similar to this little, Hoffa Street that you're seeing on the screen here, I wasn't actually pursuing in the United States by pursuing durable, traditional construction methods. And at that same time, I was reading people like Andreas Duani's Suburban Nation, or James Howard Kunstler with Geography of Nowhere, and groups like Strong Towns, and I was starting to become aware of that suburbs and the urban realm, neither of which I'd grown up in, and how in the United States, what we were living in was a product of 50, 75 years worth of zoning and rapid growth. So I decided to study architecture at Notre Dame. And the Notre Dame program is unique in that it studies traditional urban settings, traditional cities, traditional architecture, so as to learn traditional and new, but the full spectrum of our history, so as to encounter, deep patterns of, what creates environments that promote human flourishing. And it was during that process that, trying to find, what is it to create a home, that I started realizing that so many of these developments that I was studying in Europe were actually purpose-built as elderly housing or as housing for widows and orphans, right there in urban settings. So you're gonna have to forgive me. I'm gonna, just for the first like 3 or 4 slides, I'm gonna read quotes, little pieces from that article I wrote about a year ago as an introduction to, you know, what am I pursuing here? And then I'm gonna get into the types, you know, in much greater detail, both the God's house that you're seeing in front of you, and then also a model for ADU development, which obviously, you know, you have there in California. So this is, I'm reading now. What is it to have a home when we are in the final stages of life? To create a home when one is facing death. The human person is caught between 2 worlds, the world of materiality and the world of transcendent meaning. If we're to create a home in this world, it will be a dwelling that reflects this mysterious reality of the human condition. And this question, what is it to have a home when we're in the final stage of life? What is it to have a home, period? That's really what the rest of this presentation is all going to be about. And what you're seeing on the screen here is a development, inner block development in Bruges, Belgium, designed for elderly to age in place and pass away, and is still being used for that today. The environment, again, I'm reading, the environment in which one lives does not necessitate human well-being, but it does play a vital role in setting the stage for it. The environment we inhabit shapes the way we live our lives from childhood through old age, and encourages or discourages how we interact and build community with those around us. Winston Churchill famously wrote, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." This is Bruges in Belgium, one of the many cities that, while I was studying at Notre Dame, we traveled to, documented, walked, you know, extensively. It's probably the best preserved medieval city of Western Europe. And in that, it offers some development types like the God's house that have really been demolished everywhere else. You know, the God's house were throughout Belgium and the Netherlands, but they are preserved in a way in Bruges because the city itself was poor enough that it never got dismantled. Again, I'm reading. In the final years of life, this becomes that human flourishing, becomes acute, that the built environment sets the stage for human flourishing or degradation. This becomes acutely clear. In those years, as the physical and often mental capacity to function autonomously degrades, the environment in which one lives becomes ever more important in setting the stage for human flourishing or degradation. And so on the left, you see, you know, anywhere USA, you see suburbia, single family homes, and then top, you know, some kind of, you know, commercial center, which is, you know, perhaps the only thing that we have that reflects or imitates or serves as that kind of civic realm, though it's not really civic. And on the right, the traditional city of Bruges. Development after about 1950 in America, no matter what the purpose or function, was built around the automobile. For those of us with cars, this offers significant opportunity and freedom. It fits a culture that puts less value in permanence and home and more on freedom of movement. However, for those who cannot afford a car or who cannot drive, it's isolating and even dehumanizing. The average American moves every 5 years. We become in some regards a nomadic culture. Our sense of home and familiarity of place are given up for other more pressing values. As a culture, we take for granted that we'll be able to find a place that we can make our own, even if for a few years. And this kind of apartment complex, you know, with retail on the ground floor, a lot of the new urbanist movement of, let's say, like since the 70s has turned into things like this. And there's a lot of values to it. And same with the suburban, you know, single family home. There are a lot of values there. And for that, you know, probably over half of our life, right? You know, in the bottom there, I'm showing, if you can see my cursor here, you know, for this age range between whatever that is, 18 and I don't know, 65 or whatever, it suits us quite well. And so you are lacking aspects of community. You are lacking aspects of home in the place that you sleep. But this apartment complex is just that. It's simply a bedroom. It's a place to sleep. again, I'm quoting, "Despite our modern culture's weak sense of home, home is an essential backdrop to human flourishing. The loss of home is perhaps felt hardest by the elderly. Studies have shown that dementia and depression rise drastically as persons move from the home that they know and control to an assisted living or nursing home residence that they don't know and don't control. It wasn't always like this. Atul Gawande, physician and author of Being Mortal, writes that as recently as 1945, most deaths occurred in the home. By the 1980s, just 17% did. Now, argue that the nursing home or assisted living facility built in an age of the automobile does, segregate those who cannot operate or afford a car. And we all know this term of missing middle. Karen just talked about it. And really that's what you're seeing on the screen. At the bottom, you have the single family suburban home. And at the top, you have the large apartment complex, which in this case is, assisted living facility. And the missing middle is all of those building types, because missing middle building types, that was the name that Dan Perolic of Opticos coined. It was about the building types. Those are the building types between these two examples here. And it's those building types that these people that are not, if you can see my cursor, can you see my cursor? I'm getting a yes. It's this group of people and this group of people at the either end of the spectrum of life that are most hardest hit by this lack of building types here. And so at the top, we have a large apartment complex. It's designed for cars. There's a lack of autonomy. There's a lack of individuality, right? It's just an apartment room with a door onto a corridor, which works well if all it is a bedroom and you're living your 9-to-5 life and your gym and your social life and everything is outside of that building, but not when you have to spend large amounts of time in the building. There's a lack of empowerment if you're only living in that building. And it's, for many of us, it really never has the capacity to be a home. And at the bottom, you have, again, this is a development designed around cars and obviously people who can use cars. There's a lack of community in suburban sprawl. It's often called a bedroom community. And in other words, these areas empty out when during normal hours of the day. There's a lack of accessibility for elderly, and I'm talking about ADA kind of accessibility. And there's also a lack of health services. There's isolation. It's unsafe it's unsafe for elderly to age isolated in places like, this bottom image here in suburban sprawl. And I want to go back to that quote: "The three plagues of loneliness, helplessness, and boredom account for the bulk of suffering among our elders." That's Dr. Bill Thomas. And so the question is, can we do better than this? And as an architect, this is where I started looking at researching, what can traditional cities and developments and buildings teach us about how best we can build for elderly. Currently our buildings are built for those who can drive and built for those within a certain age demographic. And so what can the past tell us about the future? And I would argue that the Godshuis of Bruges offer a strikingly beautiful example of homes that are specifically designed for elderly to age and even die. And this is found within the urban block. Right here, you can see this is how you get into this little development here from the street. You walk in, it's this strikingly quiet. You walk in from the main street, there's noises on the main street, but masonry has this ability to, capture and deaden noise. You walk into this beautiful, quiet, public and yet semi-private courtyard with all of these little houses, each with their own front door facing it. So I'm going to talk about the Godshouses today, and I'm also going to talk about briefly talk about ADUs. It's really applicable in California, and the potential to develop ADUs so as to create a public realm. And that was the end of my quotes from the article. I'm just going to be telling you about these development types from now on. And before going any further, I want to point out again, these are inner block developments. And that's a critical thing when thinking about both of these. The development types are in urban settings, and they're part of the urban realm, but also removed from the urban realm. There's this semi-private, semi-public aspect to them. And so here in Bruges, this is a God's house. This is this God's house right here. And you can see this is, you know, some kind of square, and I'm sure that there are, I've been here, so I know there are shops, restaurants, there's a bakery here. Main Street, Main Street, Main Street, and there's a little door here and a little door right here. These are the only access points to this courtyard right here. This is in Philadelphia. And this, again, you know, this is an urban block. So I'm just gonna, with my cursor, show these are fronts, you know, Main Street, Main Street. So you have front, front, front on both sides. But if you know to walk down, this is similar. In Ventura County, you don't have, in California, you don't have many alleys, like residential alleys, but you do have some. And Ventura does have some alleys. So this is really what you'd expect with an alley. But when you walk down, you have to walk past these sides, right? And all of a sudden you enter into this human scaled place that everything slows down. You know, the pace of a child, the pace of a pedestrian, the pace of elderly are captured and reflected in this little minor street, as they're called in Philadelphia. So I'm going to start by talking about the God's house in Bruges. Bruges was the economic seat of Western Europe from like the 12th to the 15th centuries for a long time. It was a merchant class city. And so in some sense, you see the values, I think, displayed of the culture in a way better than in a place that's, you know, monarchical or has church hierarchy. This was a, you know, a merchant city. And so you have the kind of things that merchants supported, which among other things were the God's house. So the God's houses, these little residential courts, were built by trade guilds or wealthy philanthropists as almshouses for elderly. And as I mentioned earlier, it was a development type that was common throughout that part of Europe. So the Netherlands have their version, they're called hofjehouses. And you know, in England, they were called almshouses. But Bruges, because it's been preserved and because it was that economic seat, has more than anywhere else, right? There's a greater collection of God's houses in Bruges than probably the rest of Western Europe. So it's the place to visit. And today, 45 of these still exist in Bruges. There were many more. And the earliest existing example dates from 1330, and it's still in use today. And this is the one that I showed you earlier. 24 small houses, you know, 400 to 600 square feet, built for, in this case, it was built for elderly women in need in 1613. And there's a piece and beauty that's captured in this photograph, but you really have to visit it to really take in the beauty of this place. You know, one of my experiences in traveling to Europe originally as an undergraduate and then later with the Notre Dame school was this sense of home. You know, what is it to build a home? And I often felt more at home on these streets or in a place like this. There's a sense of coming home, a sense of being at home here that I had actually never even felt quite as much in the United States. So there is this sense of home here that you really have to go to experience. I want to point out again that it's inside of the block, right? And so here's that main street, here's that door here, here's that door here. And so you have this semi-public, semi-private world here, which is uniquely suited, I think, to the elderly, which it was built for. And each unit has its own front door, you know, you can see here. And I think that's so significant for us as individuals and for anybody to call a place a home, you know, an individual who is then free to retire into their own domain, their own home, and to have that freedom and that autonomy to make their own decisions, which is often lacking in these institutional settings where safety is, you know, the only value or the top value. Because of its location in the block, there's also pedestrian access to the daily needs of life. I pointed out earlier, there's a square down here. And at that square, there's a pharmacy, there's a restaurant, there's a bakery, there's a little grocery. And it's all within, you know, 30 seconds or a minute walk, you know, for an elderly person, maybe that extends to 2 or 3 minutes, but it's very doable and extends the autonomy of the elderly when they live in a place like that. And so here, this is the entrance from the main street. You know, look at that. It's just a little doorway, this calm, peaceful door. You walk in, here's a chapel at one end. This is, you know, looking back out the other side of this. And here's just a line of these little residential buildings, 24 of them, all facing a common court. Here's another God's house. This one built in 1912. This is 12 small houses. The last one, they were all single story. This is actually 2-story structures. Again, this is that entrance, right, from the main street. Here's the main street. And this is on the other side of town of Bruges. There's a bakery, I know, again, right down here. You walk through here, you walk down this passage, and now you're in this strikingly beautiful little courtyard here. I've read that it was actually built for, or it was at least first, the people that first lived in it were veterans dealing with shell shock coming back from World War I. Today, it's owned and operated by the city as elderly housing. So here's that main entrance off the street. You walk in, and then you have this really wonderful, you know, courtyard here. Each door is designed in such a way to maximize privacy. You know, this is going this way, this is going this way. And I remember sitting inside of this courtyard drawing. I was sketching, but also taking measurements, and I watched an elderly woman who in the United States would be, you know, tied to that elderly facility that she's living in, but she was able to, you know, walk out of her house, walk, you know, out of the courtyard. And while I was still sketching, I saw her come back, and she had on her walker 2 grocery bags with groceries. She was still able to do some of that herself. Here's an interesting one too. Again, these are all in Bruges. This is 3 courtyards, all part of the same development. This is built in 1924, but it's remarkable that how similar it is to the ones from, you know, the 1600s, the 1500s. So you have courtyard here with the main entrance off the street, courtyard here, which you enter from, I guess unfortunately this image isn't showing it, but you enter from the street there. You walk up into here, into this courtyard, and then this courtyard in the back here. So this is that entrance off the main street, this lovely, and you're looking at this building down here. You walk down and you gently curve into the larger courtyard. This is looking back at that, you know, entrance from the main street. This is the back of that first courtyard where you're looking through to the grotto in the back here. And then that image, you know, of the main space through that archway. Again, it's striking to be there in person. It's striking to see these places and see the elderly who are living and moving with autonomy in these places still today. And this is Haarlem, the Netherlands. So there are, as I said, 45 examples in Bruges, but I wanted to show a couple in the Netherlands. Here, they're called hofjehouses. This one is completely open to the street. You just see the gateway here. Single story, you know, 0 threshold on all of these, right? From an ADA point of view, there are no steps or thresholds here. And just this, you know, the attention to the public realm, the public spaces is striking. Another thing you find in the Netherlands is these Hofje streets. And so you have these little streets that are designed and built. Well, sometimes actually, if you look at the history, it's, you know, affordable housing. Sometimes it's owned and operated as elderly housing, you know, but it's kind of missing middle, not from a housing point of view, but actually from a demographic point of view. You know, it's the people on either end of that spectrum of life, you know, that elderly can find a home here. This suits their pace. It also suits the pace of a child as well. And here are some more examples in Utrecht, where you see these little doorways all facing this street, which not only serves as a street, but also serves as part of this public realm, this place for people to meet, to mingle, to live in community with others. You have both the autonomy of having your own front door, but also the proximity to others, to help, to being in an urban setting with the needs of daily life just a few steps away. So that was the Godshuis. And I'm going to return to the Godshuis on a project I'm working on at the moment, which is Godshuis inspired. But first, I wanted to talk briefly about ADUs and some of the design principles. You'll see the same design principles that we just talked about in the Godshuis reflected in some of these design principles that should be looked at when ADU policies are being put in place. And I'm talking about it because of the significance it holds for elderly housing today, for aging in place, and obviously California is, in some sense, leading the way on ADU design or ADU legislation. And partly this is also a teaser. I have been working with Strong Towns. Karen mentioned Strong Towns with Chuck Marone. I've been working with them for a year now on a 4-part article series on the American Alley, and the potential for the transformation of the alley into a minor street with the development of these ADUs. And like I said, Ventura doesn't have a bunch of alleys, but these same rules are applicable even if for any kind of interblock development. So I'm gonna just briefly talk about alleys, minor streets, and know that there's a 4-part article series coming out in Strong Towns, which I think they're then gonna turn into an ebook, so you can find more information on that. And it's something that's critical to ADU legislation. So in terms of alley, out here in Pennsylvania and most of the country, traditional cities and towns have alleys. These run down the center of urban blocks. They serve as service right for the main street. So you don't have an alley in isolation. It serves as that service street for the main street there. This is at the same scale. This urban block here, this urban block here, and this is in Philadelphia. And this has its own history, which I'm not going to get into today. But this was developed, between 1700 and, about 1800. They were developing these little minor streets. And they're the same scale as the alley. And they're remarkably suited to that demographic, that pedestrian-based demographic of elderly and children. Now, these building types, you could argue, well, you have steps and other things like that, but I'm really talking about the street here. I'm talking about this human scale that's captured here. So why the inner block? Why do I keep talking about the inner block? One of the reasons is land. And for the case, in the case of alleys and rear yards make up huge amounts of land in American cities. In Chicago alone, there's 1,900 miles of alleys. That's all I'm gonna have to stretch from Chicago to you guys. And it's not just the alley right-of-way, right? That 20-foot common street that you're seeing here. It's all of this back of yard space. And you have to understand, or, in the article series that's being published, I talk a lot about the history of that. Like, why was so much space given to this alley? And part of that is that actually all that space, was used by the infrastructure of the day, that infrastructure no longer is needed. And so we have a whole bunch of land in our urban settings, which has been locked away by modern zoning codes, which ADUs, which also is ADUs here, are kind of opening up for the first time in 100 years. Zoning was really making illegal building inside of the block. Building in the inner block has been illegal for about 100 years. And ADU legislation, which is coming out of California, out of Oregon, is unlocking that real estate in many places for the first time, in a century. And as anybody who's, looking at studying housing suited for elderly, ADUs are not quite a silver bullet, but they meet so many of those needs that are missing. It provides that autonomy with its own front door. This is the detached ADU, I guess I'm talking about now, while also being proximate to family, to loved ones, and offering a place to age in place. Let's say that you build the ADU for an aging loved one, or that person builds it for themselves, they retire into it, and then their family members move into the main house there. It allows the elderly to age in place. And it's really advocacy from groups like AARP and others that have really been remarkable in pushing for ADUs across the country. And this is really the biggest reason for me as an architect and my own passion. Why did I end up studying these places, which I only later found are most suited for elderly and children? And it's really not that they are most suited for them. I would argue that the values that I've been pursuing, like home, community, beauty, those are real values for the whole demographic, right? Age from birth to death. And yet it's the people that are bearing the brunt of the fact that our current, cities don't reflect that. That is the elderly. It was only later realizing, I'm pursuing beauty, I'm pursuing human scale. And it was once I started doing that I realized, well, the elderly are the ones that are hurting the most from the lack of it. So there's a forgotten human scale. And for almost all cities and towns across America, it never existed. And you can see this is, the typical, residential street, which is lovely. I don't mean to bash in any way the typical American residential street. But this is the traditional residential street of the past. This is the scale of the residential streets you find, let's say in Bruges or throughout, Western Europe prior to about 1800 or 1750 to 1800. And it's this scale. And this scale, there's reasons why we moved away from that scale. There were reasons why it became illegal, but I would argue that most of those reasons have been eliminated by modern technologies and infrastructure innovations. And so in Philadelphia, these are what our planned streets look like. They're wide. These are Enlightenment era streets. These are streets meant to not burn. These are streets that are really being informed by the Great Fire of London and the kind of infrastructure which didn't involve plumbing, right? So you have big wide streets so that you have lots of air in there, because you have latrines in the back, and you have night soil removal, and you have coal delivery, and you have kitchens in the back, all these things. So you have big wide streets. And in Philadelphia, there were a bunch of unplanned streets that were developed simultaneously by people that had come from Europe, come from these places that had these narrow streets, and they started building them kind of illegally on their own. And it's really these that I'm looking at as precedent for building inside the block with ADUs today. And here are more of them in Philadelphia. There's a beauty to them and a scale which is remarkable and hard to find outside of Europe in a lot of ways. There are more. And this is why they got banished, right? This is why building codes and zoning codes may outlaw them. Between 1840 and 1850, the population of Philadelphia grew by 60%. It's an industrial city. It's a city that's restrained by pedestrian movement, right? There's no public transportation until about 1860. And so you have very dense living along these narrow residential streets. And this is a quote from a group that was looking at basically, the welfare of people. I thought Philadelphia had no bad conditions, that it was a city of homes. Yet the intricate network of courts and alleys with which the interior blocks, inner block, right, are covered is a conspicuous feature. And so it was these, social workers that really banned inner block development. And I'm not going to argue with that banning of it, but what I would like to argue is all the reasons that they banned inner block development, those reasons are gone. And so if historically coal delivery, latrines, night soil removal, water wells, kitchens, all those things had a home in the inner block, well, all those things now live inside my cavity wall. And today, city plumbing, parking, emergency vehicles, all those are actually on the main street. And so many cities across the United States, towns and cities, have all this inner block land that's been locked away for a century. And ADU legislation is kind of, for the first time, starting to unlock it. So there's our inner block, yay, let's go build ADUs along alleys. And you can see, here's our alley, which is just garages and storage, and our residential street. So if this is the vision, unfortunately, this is the reality. Along with ADUs, legalizing ADUs is a huge step. But I would also argue that there are design principles that must go hand in hand. And you're going to see some of the design principles, from the God's house that we looked at earlier in Bruges reflected in what I'm about to show you. So this is our blank slate, here, 3747, how do we get to this? How do we get to forming this minor street here? So that's our, our blank slate. Here I am down there. Since I'm a human being, I have a 6-degree cone of vision. And as a traditional architect, I design around eyes. I design around how does a person perceive the world. So in this, there's nothing but chain link fence between back of building, back of building. This is not a place that I want to be. So the first rule of ADU development along alleys or around a public space, let's say you're making alleys for the first time, you don't have alleys, or some kind of public space, would be build so as to form that space by placing buildings in some kind of continuous line, some kind of way to shape a place. Modern ADU design is advertised like this. Where is this? It could be, this is like out in nature somewhere, and not to knock the ADU, like this would be a great ADU out in nature somewhere, but it's not an urban setting. If you're going to put ADUs in an urban setting, you need to recognize that they need to form space. And so this is actually, these are the Mews of London, which make remarkable elderly housing. And they weren't ever designed actually as a residential street. These are designed for carriage houses. But because they're developed in the way they are, because they form this continuous street wall, they make this, pretty remarkably lovely little residential street right there in the heart of London, right next to all those needs of daily life. Okay, so we started building ADUs, let's say, and we're putting them along our alley, and we realized that, oh wow, like that Mews I just looked at in London, that's party wall construction. Those are buildings built side by side by side by side. And so they form that space. That's going to take a long time for ADUs to finally do that. But we have examples of other things to form space besides just ADUs. So in England or Bruges or any of these interblock spaces, they're designed by not only buildings, but buildings and walls. So as a design principle, when thinking about ADUs, thinking about forming a space that can be home, forming a space that anybody, elderly, young, want to be, you form that space with buildings and walls. So here's an example of, design principle that should go hand in hand with the ADU development. And so we take that same, perspective view of the ADUs. It's not really forming a space I want to be. You add some walls, you add some trees, you start, filling in that street wall. All of a sudden, I can picture this being a home, a place where an elderly person or anybody would say, hey, this is my home. This is a place I want to walk. This is a place I want to be. And in the end, you get that scale. You get that, lost human scale if we can develop ADUs with the thought to developing, public realm. And, especially for places without alleys, this development, which you see in Philly, Brooklyn, New York, Boston even, you buy, let's say, 4 lots that are adjacent to each other on an urban block, and then you develop along them. So again, it's just containing space, building so as to form space. And what you end up with is, so this is a juncture, but what you would end up with is this line just all along here with this lovely, pedestrian walk. So alley, minor street. And I want to throw that in there, kind of, as I said, a teaser for this article series and ebook that Strong Towns is publishing. And also as a place, California is a place that's dealing with alleys, or dealing with ADUs, I'm sorry. Think about the potential. ADUs are great on their own. ADUs serve elderly just as an individual ADU. It can be so much more if you think of ADUs in some kind of form-based code so that they start to work with each other to form a public realm. Okay, back to God's house. So God's house, you know, this one pictured here is from the 1600s. How do we bring that into the 21st century? And I was lucky enough to right now be part of a project that's doing exactly that. So how do we bring that to the needs of today? You know, this is great public realm, great courtyard. I would argue the interior is probably not great. Right? This is not up to the standard of living today where this is. So the developer and I, when looking at this, one of the first things we did is say, okay, what are those pieces of the God's house that are key? What are the pieces that the key characteristics of God's house that if we're going to build it today need to come? So first, obviously, garden courtyard, right? It's that semi-public, semi-private garden courtyard, which can be entered from some kind of public realm, but is not directly part of that public realm. Second is that key, you know, like that opening. I know that threshold. I know when I'm going into there. I know that I've left the street and entered into the garden courtyard right here. And this one is going to be a hard pill to swallow for almost anybody, but I would argue that party wall masonry is really important for forming that space. And I'm sure you could create some spaces without it, but the development we're working on right now is going to be party wall. So with some of these, you know, these principles, right, these key characteristics, I'm going to go through this project I'm working on right now so you can really quickly see, okay, how do we bring the God's house, principles of the God's house to the 21st century designed for elderly living today. So the development I'm about to show you is specifically being designed for elderly living, aging in place, and remote medical care. You know, so there's going to be services that are being, you know, that are going to be, I guess, both remotely, but also visiting nurses and things like that. And so here it is. It's 16 units. Main Street, alley. You can see how this is one of these courtyards that starts to front the main street here. That's you're seeing this little perspective view of it. You can see the little God's houses, 4 of them forming this courtyard here. And then you walk through and you end up in this larger courtyard here, which is depicted here. You know, there will be, you know, big central tree and green and stuff like that. So this view here, this view is here. And here's an aerial view of it. You can see it's nestled inside the block. Because it's inside the block, it's 16 units. You know, we didn't go for 30 units or 50 units or 60 units. We went for 16 little units, 2 courtyards inside of an urban block with a little mini grocery store, which is less than 5-minute walk away. It's probably like a 3-minute walk away. And we actually incorporated parking here and here for guests and for any resident who would like parking. So these, you know, what are the building units? How do we bring that God's house building unit into the 21st century? Well, the God's house unit is probably, you know, half the size of what we would want today. You know, today, this is a single story residence is going to want to be, you know, at least 600 square feet, something like that. And so we developed 2 different units for this development we're working on. This is the single story, and this is actually slightly older. The new one is ADA compliant. And these are going to go around the main square. And this is a 2-story one, which, you know, there are 4 of these units around that smaller square that will offer, you know, a 2nd-story living space for a live-in family member, helper, whatever that may be, but offers greater flexibility, while the ground floor will be ADA accessible. And this is our inspiration. You know, look at this God's house. You know, just very simple, very lovely. And this is the interior of our large courtyard here, which is, you know, clearly reflecting this. These are our openings. This goes to that parking space, and these go to the streets on either side. And we incorporated a chapel based on a chapel straight out of Bruges into one end of the courtyard as well. And bringing back to Minka, the article that I wrote, that Karen read, talks about Minka, and Dr. Bill Thomas, who is a leading, you know, geriatrician for the United States, had worked in, really trying to restore, reinvigorate, I guess, nursing facilities, assisted living facilities of the United States for his whole career. And about, I guess in 2017, he started this group, Minka, which is basically, this is a quote, "The future of independence, optimized living is a highly distributed, digitally connected, and compact housing that is continuously modified to meet the specific needs of people living in them." Basically, that the best living for elderly today, or at least an option that should be on the table, is a small little unit that can be serviced by the new technologies, the new healthcare offerings of today, which, COVID is making this extremely clear with the value of autonomy right now, the autonomy of elderly. He's saying this is the future of elderly living, at least in our country. And I want to point out, this is 640 square feet, right? So this is 20 foot by 30 foot. And that's the same, I'm just going to go back. That's this unit size right here. So we took the same unit dimensions that Dr. Bill Thomas was using in his. And my point here is that we can bring, so this is the interior of one of these Minka homes. Let's say it's the cutting edge of elderly living today. It's this little autonomous 640 square foot home designed by Dr. Bill Thomas. And on its own, it's missing something. It's kind of like the ADU on its own. Like it's really valuable, but it really needs that courtyard. It needs that civic realm that the God's House show. And so I think that the best union would be you take this innovation of the Minka house, of this 21st century, elderly interior, and you marry it to the God's House above, which is what we're attempting to do in our development that I'm showing you now. Entrance, how do you get that urban feel, right? How do you get that entrance from the street when your street looks the way that, this does right here? How do you enter? You don't want people walking through here. So what does that look like? So we've explored a couple different things, and this is really why we have the two courtyards, right? This way I enter directly into this formed courtyard, and it's only once I get through that courtyard that I enter through this opening right here into this back courtyard here. And this one here, we've created this square, this little green in the center of a street. And then that sets up, something with walls on either side that we look down into this framed entrance into the larger courtyard here. So what are those details? So we've got the courtyard, we've got the building unit, we've got this entrance. But if you don't get the details right, you're still going to miss out on that experience of the God's House. And so some of the details that we're looking at that we're going to be bringing into this development are things like this paving pattern. Notice here in this example, very simple, look at the thresholds. This is, 0 threshold. You enter on grade. You've got these very simple brick patterns that give a sense for walking, that give a sense for these other little spaces, the little, detail around the garden here. And we're going to be bringing that into the inner courtyard there, bringing the scale down to that, kind of forgotten human scale. And again, that's the courthouse, the God's House that we're working on right now. Entrance from the main street, entrance from the main street there. And I have 2 more slides that I want to show, and then I'll be all done. I'm not the only person working on God's houses. This is a group in the Netherlands that started maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. They're called Klarnhof. And my wife is from the Netherlands, which is part of why I've been over there as many times, and I'm aware of some of the stuff that's going on over there. And I'm going to read from their website who they are. Klarnhof is the combination of the courtyards of the past. They're talking about God's house, right? And that's what the image is, God's house. The courtyards of the past with the convenience of today. This creates a unique concept of safe living with a lot of privacy, and at the same time, all the advantages of living together. Klarnhof is intended for people who like to help each other now and then, but who do not want to be obliged to do so. After all, it's not a residential group. It is, however, a non-committal community where you benefit from each other's knowledge, skills, and company. This is ideal for the modern senior who wants to remain independent and who can rely less and less on informal care and children. And this is one of their recent developments in the Netherlands. You can see two God's houses. It's very similar to the development that I just showed you that I'm working on here in the United States. And they write of this one. The question is, are you getting a bit older, and do you need care and support? At Knarrenhof, the homes are arranged in such a way that you do not have to move. In addition, there are many former nurses among our participants who can help out if necessary. So these are designed for people who are not, these are actually designed for people who haven't really hit that institutional age of elderly care. It's people who do have some mobility, but they're designed so that these people can live out, their golden years in one place, and they can age in place in these communal places with both that autonomy and proximity to care and community. And this is my final slide. I just want to say, the God's House of Bruges offer a strikingly beautiful example of homes designed for elderly to age and die. And I think for our time, we need to be looking at the inner block, that inner block space in urban settings, which is proximate to the needs of daily life, and which is kind of being unlocked for the first time in a century, both for ADUs and hypothetically God's houses. And with that, I am done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. There you are. So let's see if we've got any questions here. First of all, does anybody live want to come up and ask them a question? And otherwise, I know we've got a few, I think, in the chat here. Yeah.
Can you ask one question for us?
Sure.
I'm curious if you know how many miles of alleyways there are.
Does anybody know how many alleyways? I know even in Camarillo, which I'm familiar with, we have some alleys. So it's not a unheard of thing back here. Yeah, it'd be something to find out on that. I think you probably know, right?
You ask me?
Yeah, you don't. In terms of alleyways, any on a city and any research you've done back here in terms of specifically Ventura or neighboring cities, neighboring areas?
I have no knowledge of Ventura. I mean, I've looked at it yesterday I was looking at it on Google Earth, which is or Google Maps, which is how I knew they do have some alleys. I just know that California, with the time period that it developed and also with its Spanish roots, it did not get the alleys in the way that was just kind of ubiquitous across the rest of the country. So if you go to any historic town in the Midwest, East Coast, every single street basically had a traditional block has an alley, where in California, they're just, you can't take them for granted in the same way. That's all.
Yeah, I had a question about support. So people living in those communities, and it's not a co-housing. You mentioned that at the end. It's not like a co-housing where you're sharing so much space. There is more individuality, but what kind of support do people have generally in that? We have some Laguna Hills down here in Orange County, Leisure World, Leisure Village up here in Camarillo. There are senior communities, but there's not a lot of supportive, it just happens to be a neighborhood where seniors live.
Right.
You have to be seniors.
Right. And I guess I want to start by saying that I'm not a good person to answer the question. As an architect, somebody design, studying these, that's one part of the equation, but we are dealing with that issue. I'm trying to answer that question in part with the developer I'm working on in this God's House today. We're still in the early stages of schematic design, or I guess, of design. So what we're finding is that COVID is offering new things, right? New things are coming out of COVID, and that with telemedicine and some of the visiting healthcare options that are showing up, I think that's really going to open up the door more and more to aging in place, to the new, kind of revolution in ADUs, because I think ADUs themselves are going to kind of set a new standard and also market demand for visiting nurses, and there are going to be new offerings there. And I know that there are a handful of like tech startups in Florida which are designed specifically around exactly this. They're operating a number of ADUs, and they are both, filling that ADU and taking care of that, operational aspects of it, and also providing the ADU, it's for elderly, with access to both remote care and also visiting nurses. So I do know that there are startups that are working on that aspect of it, and I think more and more we're going to see it being a common offering.
Awesome.
So I see a question from the online attendees here, and they're asking, where in the US is the project that you're working on now?
I'm sorry, can you say it again? Where?
Where in the US is the project that you're working on now?
For the sake of the developer that I'm working on right now, I'm not going to answer that question, but I am going to be writing an article within the next 6 months on it. So watch for strong towns.
And I have a question, if we don't have anybody lined up there. How does this all pencil out, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if I understand, there are spaces that are not being utilized, and part of the idea is to start utilizing that space. But then some developer will say, well, it makes more sense for me to build something more dense than some of these things that would serve seniors. How do you make that work?
Yeah, I think I'm really, the hard part, right? We could imitate what we see in Bruges, right? If there was somebody who wanted to do that, or an architect can just draw it up. From a design point of view, it's very simple. There's nothing to design. As an architect, I'm trying to touch it as little as possible in some sense, for the project I'm working on now. From a building point of view, it's also very simple. So I think that the difficult part is probably going to be finding that developer who's willing to stick his neck out and do it. And I think that there's going to be market demand for it. I think that's what's going to push, but it's hard to do it for the first time. So I'm really blessed to be working with somebody who is inspired and driven to do it. And I think part of his inspiration is that his own parents are going to be looking for some kind of elderly housing option soon. And so inspired by that, he's trying to create something beautiful that presumably they could live in. I don't know, I don't mean to be speaking for him, I'm guessing, but someplace that really meets some of those needs that I talked about at the very beginning, at the introduction to this. What are those places that really are lacking now? If the greatest burden of our elderly today are, our loneliness, boredom, and lack of, autonomy, these places, I think, address that, and I think market demand will recognize that. So I hope that the market demand will push for things like this.
Hi, I'm in the audience here live. Thank you so much for your presentation. I've been to Bruges. I want the Venice of Belgium and take a ride. I'm curious as to your thinking on the policy angle on this. It seems to me that ADU law was about flexibility in California, right? Letting individuals choose how and what to develop on their own property. I want to know how you're thinking about squaring the circle of a very intentional ADU community where you have to get all this buy-in, a standard design. Your thoughts about that? How you're going to go about this?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, and I think that probably that question is going to need to be answered by each municipality that's passing ADU codes. So I live in a pre-Revolutionary War era town here outside Philadelphia. All of our urban blocks have alleys. They all have a presence on an alley. And so in some sense, you don't have the kind of, we're dense enough maybe that you don't have the option to just build wherever without any kind of implication on the rest of the town. And so what I would suggest is that for some places, for some municipalities, for some streets, and maybe this is a street by street or a block by block ADU code, that if your block has an alley, a municipality should consider whether or not, and going hand in hand with building a new ADU, either that ADU needs to be built along the alley so as to start to form this place, or at least that you're building some kind of wall along your lot on the alley. But yes, what can a private homeowner do to actually create that, that space? And only one piece. And if there's only one homeowner or two homeowners or four homeowners that are building along that alley, you're not going to achieve that public realm. It does have to be a holistic vision that, both the residents and the city have to kind of get behind. But I do think that one of the beauties of interblock development is that you don't need, like form-based codes would be like the whole downtown, right? It's a form-based code for your whole municipality. Interblock development is its own little world. And so you can enter it, you could have a form-based code for a block. It could be a test block, right? Like there in Ventura, like here's the alley, we're gonna test it out. The residents are on board. These are gonna be the one page of design guidelines. It's an alley form-based code. And that's what I have my own little practice here called interblock. And that's what I'm working on. It's these little form-based codes, one page, let's say, that goes with an interblock that can go hand in hand with ADU legislation and doesn't need to be, common throughout your downtown or your town at all. It can just be one block at a time. But that's a fabulous question. There is a conflict, right, between the public realm and the private freedom of building anywhere. And I think both have a huge amount of value. And I think our elderly lean on that public realm more than people who are not living in their home as much.
Thank you. Anyone else? And Miguel, is there anyone else Q&A or chat?
Nothing else on the chat.
Okay. I want to give Ari here and Sonia a chance to talk about the Ventura County area agents. I'll let you. Okay. Sonia, I know you're virtual here. You want to tell us a little bit about what you do here, and then kind of address this in terms of our needs for seniors specifically to Ventura County.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, for the presentation. It was very informative. Listening to the ADUs and everything, it really puts, I really personally think it's a great idea. Being the call center manager here at the Ventura County Area Agency on Aging, we get calls from seniors who are, in dire need of, they're isolated. They need someone to talk to. I think the concept of the ADU would really be beneficial to them because they're not being put set aside pretty much, thinking of we're all going to age, thinking of the fact that I might be going to maybe a assisted living facility. It's almost scary, right? Because I still want to be part of the community. I still want to be surrounded by different people, not just seniors. So I think that the concept of the ADUs are really great. It would work with, with the fact that seniors can have someone to interact with, and it will help them with their loneliness problem or boredom. And, right now we have a spike in people wanting to help. So, so really having these ADUs throughout, I mean, the county, that I think that's great. It would really help seniors a whole lot, especially with isolation. And that's what we're really seeing right now.
In our county, do you see places where, see any examples of this kind of missing middle senior housing? Are there any local examples that you can point to? That seems to be, yeah, you did it right there. Let's try to emulate this.
I can't think of any. Yeah, I can't think of any that you mean that have ADUs?
Yeah, not necessarily under the ADU guidelines, you know, something akin to a you know, a God's house type of courtyard community, small, shared but independent, you know, within walkable distance to different services and everything.
I see. I mean, well, the most, you know, the newest projects were like, for example, River Park. You know, I know that there is some low-income housing there, but I don't know that there is senior housing in there. Or
Yeah.
actually there is an assisted living facility across the freeway, but once again, it's, you know, very expensive. It's pricey. A lot of our seniors that we come in contact with, there's just no way they can afford it. One, and it is accessible to other like, you know, stores, gyms, things like that. But the focus on the ADUs would be great. I think in that area, River Park behind, maybe I can think of more alleyways because they're older homes. So many of those streets do have alleys versus the newer communities. They're staying away from them.
Because, you know,
Sonia, you're in the same position as the rest of the country in that you don't have things that look like that. And Karen, you're gonna be hard pressed to find a God's house anywhere outside of Bruges or the Netherlands. So maybe you should be the first to bring it.
Now,
Will
we
do.
have here for Sonia and Thomas. So from Derek Wada is asking, he said, I'm currently working on a 50-unit senior housing development in Camarillo. We are in the design phase of the project. What are your recommendations regarding design to address issues like isolation, creating a sense of place, etc.? You're muted, Thomas.
Thanks. I guess I would point to the presentation I just gave, you know, all of these aspects that the God's house, you know, what are these key characteristics that were reflected there. And then also, you know, just very brief, we talked about in the alley bit. Like I said, there's going to be a much longer 4-part series coming out by Strong Towns in the next couple weeks on alley development. But it would be getting to this sense of autonomy and yet proximity that this little green door gives you, you know, the green door onto this public private realm, this series of courtyards that are impossible when you have a double-loaded corridor. Well, it's just not the same, you know. So I think that the point that the models I'm looking at, the things that I'm pointing to here, as a way to address these burdens that Dr. Bill Thomas is talking about, you know, with loneliness and boredom and lack of autonomy. That front door, and Atul Gawande writes about this a lot in his Being Mortal book, goes a long way in that. And so conventional development on a double-loaded corridor that's highly dense and 4 stories just can't do that. So yeah, build a series of residential courts.
What Tom said.
Any other questions or comments? And this is going to be recorded. This is being recorded, and I will send you guys out all the link. We have a YouTube channel that we'll be posting this on. So I'll send you all out the link, and you can continue to ruminate over this and get inspiration from it. And hopefully we can move forward on all this. Really appreciate, Thomas, you taking your time, and Sonia and everybody here. If you want some policy at the state level, talk to Benjamin over here with Monique Ramon's office. Oh yes, I had to put you on the spot there. Because, you know, it's our squeaky wheel from the bottom up, from all of us. And yeah, and then the inspiration, and then the guidance and the policy that allows us to be able to do some of this. So keep it up.
Thank you so much, Karen, for inviting me and letting me talk to you all today. Thank you so much, all of you out there. For,
okay. I appreciate it. Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.